On the morning after Operation Market Garden collapsed, Winston Churchill was handed a set of reports that told a story he had spent the better part of 2 years trying to avoid. The papers detailed shattered airborne units, bridges that had not been taken, German counterattacks that should never have existed in the strength reported, and casualty numbers that climbed with every updated line of text. The failure was not marginal, it was total. The plan that was meant to end the war before Christmas had instead ensured that the war would continue into another winter. At the center of that failure stood Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the man Churchill had personally elevated into the symbol of British land power in Europe. And yet, as the scale of the disaster became undeniable, one thing was equally clear: Montgomery would not be removed. Churchill understood immediately what the public did not. The question was no longer whether Montgomery had failed. The question was whether Britain could survive admitting it. By late 1944, Britain's position inside the Allied coalition was fragile in ways that were not visible on maps or casualty charts. Militarily, the war in Europe was increasingly being carried by American manpower, American industry, and American speed. Politically, Britain was still trying to present itself as an equal partner rather than a declining empire relying on American strength. Montgomery had become the physical embodiment of that illusion. Removing him would not simply acknowledge a failed operation. It would confirm that British command no longer set the pace of the war. This was the central trap Churchill had created for himself. Montgomery was not just a general. He was a public construction, carefully built after years of humiliation that had nearly broken British confidence in its own military leadership. The fall of France, the evacuation at Dunkirk, the surrender at Singapore, and the repeated failures in North Africa had left Britain desperate for a commander who could restore credibility. When Montgomery defeated Rommel at El Alamein, Churchill seized the opportunity. He praised Montgomery relentlessly. He framed him as the model of British professionalism: careful, disciplined, methodical, and humane with his men. The victory was elevated beyond its tactical importance. It became a moral turning point. Britain, Churchill declared, had found its general. From that moment forward, Montgomery's reputation was welded to Britain's national pride. Every success reinforced it. Every criticism threatened to unravel it. Churchill knew that once a symbol reaches that level, it no longer belongs to the man who wears it. It belongs to the nation that needs it. And by 1944, Britain needed Montgomery far more than Montgomery needed Britain. Behind closed doors, Churchill was far less impressed with Montgomery's conduct than his public statements suggested. He was aware of Montgomery's rigid personality, his intolerance of dissent, and his habit of overstating both German strength before battles and his own brilliance afterward. He knew Montgomery had a tendency to demand overwhelming resources for operations that American commanders believed could be executed faster and with fewer delays. He also knew Montgomery's ego was becoming a problem. His public statements irritated Eisenhower. His contempt for Patton was barely concealed. His insistence on sole credit strained Allied unity at moments when unity was essential. Yet Churchill consistently chose to manage these problems quietly rather than confront them publicly. The reason was simple. Churchill could argue with Montgomery in private. He could not replace him without undermining Britain's standing in the alliance. By 1944, Allied command was no longer a balance of equals. The United States supplied the majority of troops in Europe. American generals commanded vast formations that dwarfed British field armies. Eisenhower, not Montgomery, was supreme commander. Churchill understood that if Montgomery were removed after a major failure, the Americans would not replace him with another British commander of equal stature. They would fill the vacuum themselves. Market Garden forced this reality into the open. Montgomery promised a bold thrust into Germany, a narrow corridor that would leapfrog the Rhine and collapse German resistance before it could reorganize. Churchill approved the plan despite warnings from intelligence officers and reservations from American commanders who questioned the optimistic assumptions underlying the operation. When the plan failed, the consequences were immediate and undeniable. British airborne forces were annihilated at Arnhem. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The Germans regrouped. The war extended into 1945. Churchill was furious, but his fury was constrained by political calculation. Removing Montgomery would require Churchill to explain to Parliament, to the press, and to the public why the general he had personally championed was no longer fit to command. That explanation would invite scrutiny, not just of Montgomery's decisions, but of Churchill's judgment. It would open the door to the question Churchill feared most, whether British methods of war had become obsolete. That fear was not abstract. Churchill had watched American commanders operate with a tempo Britain could not match. He had seen Patton advance hundreds of miles across France, while Montgomery paused to consolidate, prepare, and demand additional resources. He had watched Eisenhower increasingly rely on American initiative rather than British caution. He understood that the future of modern warfare favored speed, logistics, and mass areas where American strength was overwhelming. Montgomery represented the old British doctrine of war. He emphasized preparation over momentum, minimizing casualties even at the cost of delay. Churchill had defended this approach for years because it aligned with Britain's limited manpower and political sensitivity to losses. But by late 1944, the strategic environment had changed. The Soviets were advancing relentlessly in the east. Every week of delay in the west meant more territory falling under Stalin's control. Speed now mattered more than perfection. Churchill knew this, but acknowledging it publicly would mean admitting that Britain no longer led the coalition in strategic innovation. It would mean conceding that American methods, not British ones, were shaping the outcome of the war. Montgomery's continued presence allowed Churchill to postpone that admission. The pressure to remove Montgomery did not come only from American commanders. It also came from within Britain's own military establishment. Officers quietly questioned why Montgomery continued to receive protection despite repeated controversies. His handling of resources, his rigid command style, and his inability to adapt to changing conditions were increasingly difficult to defend. But Churchill resisted these pressures because he understood something his critics did not. Montgomery was not being protected because he was flawless. He was being protected because he was irreplaceable in political terms. Removing Montgomery would have sent a signal that Britain had lost confidence in its own leadership. It would have confirmed that American commanders now defined the tempo and direction of the war. Churchill feared that once that signal was sent, Britain's influence over post-war planning would evaporate. Decisions about Europe's future would be made in Washington and Moscow, not London. Churchill's calculations were shaped by more than military concerns. He was already thinking about the post-war world. He understood that Britain would emerge from the war economically exhausted, dependent on American loans and overshadowed by two superpowers. Preserving Britain's prestige during the war was his way of preserving leverage afterward. Montgomery, for all his flaws, was a symbol Churchill could use in those negotiations. Publicly humiliating him would weaken Britain's bargaining position. Privately sidelining him would risk provoking a backlash from the British public, which still viewed Montgomery as a national hero. Churchill was acutely aware of how quickly public confidence could collapse. He had lived through the disasters of 1940. He knew morale was as much a weapon as tanks or aircraft. So Montgomery stayed. Churchill absorbed the criticism. He deflected blame. He framed Market Garden as a bold gamble rather than a catastrophic miscalculation. He praised Montgomery's intentions even as he quietly reduced his strategic influence behind the scenes. This dual approach allowed Churchill to maintain appearances while adapting to reality. By late 1944, Churchill had begun to shift power subtly away from Montgomery without removing him outright. Eisenhower was given greater authority. American advances were prioritized. Montgomery's demands were increasingly moderated or delayed. The change was not announced. It was implemented quietly, the way Churchill preferred to manage uncomfortable truths. This was the core of Churchill's dilemma. He could not remove Montgomery because doing so would expose Britain's declining role in the war. He could not fully support him because his failures were becoming impossible to ignore. The solution was compromise: preserve the symbol while limiting the substance. Churchill understood that history would judge him not only by battles won or lost, but by whether Britain emerged from the war with dignity intact. Montgomery was part of that calculation. He was a flawed commander, but he was also a shield. Behind him, Churchill could maneuver politically, manage alliances, and prepare Britain for a world where it would no longer dominate by force. This was the reality Churchill faced after Market Garden. Montgomery's failures were real, but removing him would have caused a failure far greater than any single operation. It would have signaled the end of Britain's claim to leadership in the war. Churchill was willing to tolerate military embarrassment to avoid political irrelevance. And so, Montgomery remained in command, not because he could not be replaced, but because Britain could not afford to replace him. By the winter of 1944, Winston Churchill had reached a stage of the war where almost every decision carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. The failures associated with Bernard Montgomery were no longer isolated incidents that could be explained away by weather, logistics, or enemy resistance. They had become a pattern, one that senior officers, Allied commanders, and even members of Churchill's own cabinet quietly recognized. Yet Montgomery remained in place, and Churchill continued to defend him publicly. This contradiction was not accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply political. Churchill's private correspondence from late 1944 reveals a man increasingly aware that the war he had entered in 1939 was no longer being shaped by British doctrine or British tempo. He wrote repeatedly about the velocity of American operations, the scale of their logistics, and their willingness to accept operational risk in pursuit of decisive results. He admired this speed, but it also unsettled him. Britain had built its military culture on caution because it had no choice. Its manpower was limited. Its economy was stretched thin. Its population would not tolerate the kind of casualty figures the Americans could absorb. Montgomery's methodical approach fit Britain's constraints, even if it increasingly clashed with the realities of coalition warfare. This tension became impossible to ignore after Market Garden. Churchill had approved the operation in part because he needed a British-led success that would reassert relevance at a moment when American forces were dominating headlines. He knew Eisenhower's patience with Montgomery was wearing thin. He knew Patton's rapid advances were making British caution look outdated. Market Garden was supposed to be Montgomery's answer to that criticism, a dramatic demonstration that British planning could still deliver strategic breakthroughs. When it failed, the consequences were not just military. They were existential for Britain standing inside the alliance. American commanders were furious, though their anger was measured. Eisenhower understood that openly attacking Montgomery would destabilize Allied unity at a critical moment. But behind closed doors, his frustration was unmistakable. He complained that Montgomery's insistence on resources delayed operations unnecessarily. He questioned the assumptions behind Market Garden and resented Montgomery's refusal to accept responsibility for its failure. Eisenhower did not demand Montgomery's removal, but his confidence in him declined sharply. Churchill knew this, and it worried him. If Eisenhower lost faith entirely, Britain's influence over Allied strategy would shrink even further. The situation placed Churchill in a paradox. He needed Montgomery as a political counterweight to American dominance, but he also needed to prevent Montgomery from derailing the war effort. Removing him was impossible. Allowing him unrestricted authority was equally dangerous. The solution Churchill chose was subtle erosion. Montgomery would remain the public face of British command, but his operational independence would be quietly reduced. Decisions would increasingly be filtered through Eisenhower. Resources Montgomery demanded would be negotiated, delayed, or redirected. The change would not be announced. It would be implemented gradually, without confrontation. Churchill was experienced enough to understand that open conflict with Montgomery would backfire. Montgomery was not just a general, he was a celebrity. British newspapers still portrayed him as the soldier who had beaten Rommel and restored national confidence. Publicly humiliating him after Market Garden would provoke outrage, confusion, and political instability. Churchill had spent his career navigating public opinion, and he knew that wartime morale was fragile. Removing Montgomery would invite uncomfortable questions not just about Montgomery's competence, but about Churchill's judgment in elevating him so prominently in the first place. Behind closed doors, however, Churchill's tone changed. He began to express doubts about Montgomery's ability to adapt to the new phase of the war. He acknowledged that Montgomery's insistence on set peace battles no longer matched the fluid nature of the conflict. He worried that Montgomery's ego had become a liability, particularly in dealing with American counterparts who expected cooperation rather than condescension. Churchill did not deny these problems. He simply refused to address them publicly. One of Churchill's greatest fears was that removing Montgomery would accelerate Britain's marginalization within the alliance. The Americans did not need British forces to win the war. They needed them politically, symbolically, and diplomatically. Montgomery's presence helped sustain the fiction of equal partnership. Without him, Britain risked becoming a junior contributor whose opinions could be politely acknowledged and quietly ignored. Churchill had no illusions about how quickly that transition could occur. He had watched France fall from great power to occupied nation in a matter of weeks. He knew prestige, once lost, was nearly impossible to recover. Churchill also understood that Montgomery's removal would not produce a clear successor. Britain had capable commanders, but none possessed Montgomery's public stature. Replacing him with a lesser-known general would signal weakness. Replacing him with an American would confirm Britain's decline. Neither option was acceptable. Montgomery, flawed as he was, remained the least damaging choice. This reality shaped Churchill's response to criticism from within the British military. Senior officers who questioned Montgomery's performance were listened to, but rarely acted upon. Their concerns were absorbed into quiet adjustments rather than decisive action. Churchill preferred management to confrontation. He believed that time, not punishment, would solve the problem. As the war progressed and American forces continued to expand their role, Montgomery's influence would naturally diminish without the need for dramatic intervention. The Battle of the Bulge reinforced this approach. When the German counteroffensive erupted in December 1944, Montgomery once again found himself at the center of controversy. His assumption of temporary command over American forces north of the Bulge infuriated Patton and irritated Bradley. Montgomery's public statements after the battle suggested that British leadership had stabilized the front, an implication that American commanders considered insulting and inaccurate. Churchill was again forced to intervene, smoothing relations, clarifying statements, and preventing the dispute from exploding into a public rift. Privately, Churchill recognized that Montgomery's behavior was damaging Allied cohesion. But he also recognized that disciplining Montgomery publicly would hand the Americans a propaganda victory and undermine British authority. The balance was delicate. Churchill chose restraint, even when it cost him credibility with his own allies. By early 1945, the pattern was clear. Montgomery would not be removed. He would not be fully empowered. He would be tolerated, managed, and gradually sidelined. Churchill's role was to maintain the illusion of stability while adapting to a shifting balance of power. This was not cowardice, it was realism. Churchill understood that Britain's survival as a major power depended less on battlefield brilliance than on diplomatic positioning. Churchill's diaries and later memoirs hint at the emotional toll this took. He admired Montgomery's discipline and professionalism, but he resented his inflexibility and self-promotion. He valued British tradition, but he could not deny that American speed was winning the war. He wanted unity, but unity increasingly meant compromise on Britain's terms. Montgomery embodied all of these contradictions. What Churchill never did was openly admit that Montgomery had outlived his usefulness as a decisive battlefield commander. Doing so would require acknowledging that British military doctrine itself was being eclipsed. Churchill was not ready to make that admission publicly, even if he accepted it privately. The war demanded victory, but it also demanded dignity. Churchill was determined that Britain would emerge from the conflict, not as a defeated empire clinging to past glories, but as a respected partner that had played a central role in defeating Nazism. This determination shaped every decision Churchill made regarding Montgomery. He absorbed criticism. He deflected blame. He managed egos. He chose symbolism over confrontation. He protected Montgomery not because Montgomery deserved protection, but because Britain needed the protection Montgomery's image provided. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in force and pushed into Germany, Montgomery's role was already changing. American formations dominated the advance. Eisenhower's authority was unquestioned. Montgomery's presence remained visible but increasingly ceremonial. Churchill allowed this transition to occur quietly, without drama, without the scandal that removal would have caused. This was Churchill's strategy: preserve the symbol while surrendering the substance. It was not ideal, it was not satisfying, but it was effective. Britain remained at the table. Its voice still mattered. Its flag still flew alongside America's and the Soviet Union's. Montgomery's continued command, flawed as it was, made that possible. Churchill knew that history would debate Montgomery's competence. He also knew that history would judge him on whether Britain survived the war with its influence intact. When forced to choose between military perfection and political survival, Churchill chose survival. That choice explains why Montgomery stayed, and it sets the stage for what came next. By the spring of 1945, Winston Churchill no longer needed to ask whether Bernard Montgomery could still deliver decisive victories. The answer had already been given, quietly and unmistakably, by the way the war was now being fought. American forces dominated the advance into Germany. Their armies moved faster, struck deeper, and dictated the tempo of operations across the Western Front. Montgomery was still present, still photographed, still referred to as Britain's senior field commander, but the reality of power had shifted. Churchill had not removed him. He had simply outgrown him. This was the outcome Churchill had engineered deliberately, because by early 1945 he understood that the most dangerous moment for Britain was not losing battles, but losing relevance. Montgomery's continued presence allowed Britain to maintain the appearance of parity with the Americans, while quietly adapting to a new reality. Churchill never intended Montgomery to lead the final act of the war in Europe. He intended him to stand as a symbol, while others carried out the decisive work. Churchill's private writings from this period reveal a man who had come to terms with uncomfortable truths. He no longer spoke of Montgomery as the indispensable commander of El Alamein. Instead, he referred to him as a necessary figure, a man whose reputation still mattered even if his influence no longer did. Churchill understood that public perception often lagged behind reality, and he exploited that gap ruthlessly. As long as the British public believed Montgomery remained central to victory, Churchill could manage the transition without shock. Montgomery sensed this shift, and it infuriated him. He had never accepted that American commanders would eclipse him. He believed deeply in his own methods and viewed criticism as ignorance rather than insight. When Eisenhower increasingly bypassed him or limited his authority, Montgomery blamed politics rather than performance. He believed Churchill had betrayed him quietly, not by dismissal, but by tolerating the erosion of his power. This resentment hardened after the Rhine crossings, when American forces surged forward while Montgomery's role became increasingly administrative. Churchill never confronted Montgomery openly about this change. He did not need to. The structure of command spoke for itself. Montgomery's proposals were scrutinized more closely. His demands for resources were negotiated rather than granted automatically. His public statements were managed carefully to avoid further friction with American allies. Churchill allowed Montgomery to remain in uniform and in title, but he ensured that decisions no longer flowed exclusively through him. This approach allowed Churchill to achieve something remarkable. Britain exited the war without a public reckoning over Montgomery's failures. There was no dramatic dismissal, no parliamentary scandal, no national crisis of confidence. Montgomery remained a hero to many, his failures softened by time and overshadowed by earlier successes. Churchill had protected the image, even as he accepted the reality. Churchill's greatest fear had been that removing Montgomery would force Britain to admit openly that it no longer set the standard for modern warfare. By keeping him, Churchill avoided that admission until the war was already won. When the reckoning finally came, it arrived quietly, through post-war reassessment rather than wartime humiliation. This decision had consequences. Montgomery never forgave Churchill for what he perceived as abandonment. Their relationship, once cooperative, became strained and distant. Montgomery believed he had been used as a political shield, and in many ways he was right. Churchill had used Montgomery's reputation to preserve Britain standing long enough to secure a seat at the post-war table. Churchill never denied this privately. He believed the outcome justified the means. The end of the war confirmed Churchill's instincts. Britain emerged victorious but exhausted. Its empire was weakening. Its economy was shattered. Its global influence depended increasingly on diplomacy rather than force. In this new world, prestige mattered more than ever. The memory of British generals standing alongside American commanders helped sustain the illusion of equal partnership long enough to shape post-war negotiations. Churchill's critics argued that Montgomery should have been removed after Market Garden, that accountability demanded it. Churchill understood that accountability in coalition warfare was not the same as accountability in a national army. Removing Montgomery would have satisfied critics, but weakened Britain's strategic position. Churchill chose the harder path, the one that required enduring criticism and managing egos rather than making dramatic gestures. History has been kinder to Montgomery than many of his contemporaries expected. His victories are remembered. His failures are debated rather than condemned. This outcome was not accidental. It was the result of Churchill's deliberate effort to control the narrative while the war was still being fought. By the time historians reassessed Montgomery's record, Britain had already secured its place among the victors. Churchill himself never fully reconciled with the compromises he made. In later years, he reflected on the war with pride and regret intertwined. He admired American speed even as he mourned British decline. He respected Montgomery's discipline even as he questioned his adaptability. He believed he had done what was necessary, even if it meant protecting a general who no longer represented the future of warfare. The truth is that Churchill did not keep Montgomery because Montgomery was indispensable on the battlefield. He kept him because Britain needed time. Time to adjust, time to transition. Time to accept that the world after 1945 would not be shaped by British arms alone. Montgomery bought that time, not through brilliance but through symbolism. When the war ended, Montgomery stood among the victors, his uniform immaculate, his reputation intact. Churchill stood beside him, outwardly triumphant, inwardly aware of the cost. The partnership between Britain and America had shifted irrevocably. The age of British military leadership had passed. Churchill had seen it coming long before others were willing to admit it. This was why Montgomery could not be removed despite repeated failures. Not because Churchill was blind to those failures, but because Churchill understood something deeper. Wars are not only won on battlefields, they are won in perception, diplomacy, and timing. Montgomery's continued command allowed Britain to navigate the most dangerous transition in its modern history without collapse. Churchill chose compromise over confrontation, symbolism over satisfaction, survival over pride. In doing so, he preserved Britain's voice in a world where its power was fading. Montgomery remained not because he was perfect, but because he was useful in a way no other commander could be. That is the truth behind Churchill's decision. Not weakness, not favoritism, but a cold, calculated understanding of what Britain could afford to lose and what it could not.